Hey everybody, welcome to this week's series of material form and context videos. This week, we continue our exploration of sonnet form, which means that we get to build on all of the knowledge that we gained last week. Last week, the learning curve was high. We had to learn a lot about sonnet form, about rhyme scheme, about meter, and lots of other things, but we're going to be able to use all of that knowledge this week as we continue to explore sonnets. As you can see, this week we're focusing on just one author and his sonnets, that of William Shakespeare. And we're going to start this video series by focusing on the material forms of Shakespeare's sonnets. Okay, so you remember last week that we've transitioned into the world of print. We now have the printing press in England. We have things printed rather than simply copied into manuscripts. And yet, as you also remember, there's still a tension between print and manuscript. And most poets still prefer to keep their writing private in a manuscript that they circulate among their coterie or their friends, rather than publishing it for the masses in cheap, degradable form. The same is true for Shakespeare. We only have a copy of his sonnets in this printed copy, printed in 1609, but we know that he was writing them throughout the 1590s and the early 17th century, and he was likely circulating them in manuscript form among his coterie. We don't have any surviving records of that. All we have is this publication of his sonnets in 1609. But again, we know that they were written much earlier. We don't even know if Shakespeare wanted his sonnets to be printed. A publisher decided to print them himself. We have no idea if Shakespeare himself even asked for that or consented to it. As we're learning more about print, I want to talk a little bit more about the different sizes of books that could be printed and what meaning those had. This, for example, is a quarto, and I'm going to tell you next what that exactly means. All right, so if you're at a Renaissance or early modern book publisher, you'll find that they have a bunch of paper in a stack that's all the same size. It's a really big size. And every book that they print is made up of that paper folded into different sizes. So let's say you fold the paper once. This is the paper, you fold it once. That's the folio size. If you fold it again, I am unable to do this with my hands. If you fold it again, that's a quarto size. And if you fold it again, it's an octavo, and then things just get smaller and smaller and smaller. So one of the smallest sizes you can get is like the 64mo. And yes, they abandon the Latin at that point and just start using, normal English numbers, the 64mo. Here's an example of what that can look like. So books could get very, very small. You just had to fold the paper that many times. Now, the distinction I want you to note is that the folio size, again, that first fold, those books were often very expensive. They were often bound in fancy bindings and covers and were very expensive to buy. Quartos, meanwhile, that next smaller size, were very cheap. They were not usually bound, and they were like a paperback. They were not very costly. They were very inexpensive to buy, and they were usually discarded very easily and thrown away because they were of a cheaper quality. Shakespeare's sonnets and a lot of his plays were printed in quarto size during his lifetime, which meant that it was a very cheap publication that people could buy without a lot of money. These title pages also tell us a lot about where things were printed, who printed them. We know that Shakespeare's sonnets were printed in London by G. Eld for TT or Thomas Thorpe, and they'll be sold by John Wright at Christ Church Gate. So we learn a lot about how the early modern publishing industry worked from these title pages. Another key aspect, I'm moving my head down so you can see it, is the dedication. And you'll notice that it says here, "To the only begetter of these ensuing sonnets, Mr. W.H." We'll stop there because that's really crucial. First of all, it's really interesting that Mr. W.H. is referred to as the begetter of these sonnets, as if this person birthed the sonnets. Now, they're not talking about Shakespeare here. They're talking about potentially Shakespeare's muse, the person who birthed these sonnets for Shakespeare. And the person it's dedicated to is Mr. W.H. Who is Mr. W.H.? Well, it's likely that It was Henry Wriothesley, which is really HW. We're not sure why it would have been printed WH, but this is one scholarly supposition that it was Henry Wriothesley, who is not only an aristocratic person, the third Earl of Southampton, but he was also Shakespeare's patron. And we haven't talked about patronage in this course, but it's basically a system where a writer gets paid by an aristocrat to write poetry. This is before a writer would sell his book or his novel or his poems to the mass market and get paid that way. That didn't quite exist. It was just starting to exist in Shakespeare's day when you could sell your publications and make enough money to live. So the other way to make money was to have an aristocrat sponsor you. So it's likely that Henry Wriothesley was his patron, and that is who the poems are dedicated to. Now, things get much juicier than that, so stay tuned for the next few videos. I'm back. One more slide. I almost forgot. Before there were cats of Instagram, there were cats of Renaissance portraits. And Mr. Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton, had a very handsome kitty, and I wanted you all to see it.